Thank you, Tom. And I appreciate being here. I see a number of familiar faces out there, and look forward to going over a couple of different items with the group today. And from my perspective, I like to keep these sort of discussions as informal as possible. So I know we're on a time schedule, but if there's questions that come up as I move through the material that I'm going to be discussing this evening, I'm happy to take questions right away, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end as well. What I'm hoping to go over this evening is a couple things. One, and to start out with, is a discussion about levy limits, and these have been in place for some time. And the most important part, I think, of this discussion will be focused on some strategies to manage the impact and the limitations of levy limits. From there, as Tom had mentioned, one of the things that Ehlers is very involved with is financing of projects for municipalities. And I don't intend to get into any of the minutia, but just big picture, talking about what are the options available and what's the process for financing, and also to talk a little bit about what's the current conditions for issuing debt. And then lastly, excuse me, another area that we get very involved in, and it's different for towns and villages and cities, is tax increment financing. I just have a couple issues to hit on there that are coming up and specific to the time that we're at now. All right. So starting out with levy limits, and it doesn't seem like it's really that long ago, but it is. These were initially put into place in the levies that municipalities were doing in 2005 for collection in 2006. And as many of you are probably aware, the law has changed in numerous ways since that point in time. And currently, the current limit that you have as municipalities is last year's actual levy, but then it can be increased by a percentage equal to the net new construction that your community achieved in the previous year. But if that is zero, you are limited to zero. There isn't a minimum percentage increase that you get. Now, as I'd mentioned, tax increment financing, if you're a community that has a tax increment district that has successfully completed its goals and is now closing, the levy limit does allow the ability to take advantage of that to increase your levy to some degree, but some of that return of the tax base and growth of the tax base from moving a tax increment district from being a separate fund back to the general fund of your municipality needs to be directed to property tax relief. And there's also a number of adjustments that are allowable under the worksheet that you are asked to complete each year and supply to the state. And we'll touch on some of those this evening. Now, there's a couple of carry forward options related to levy limits, and these are somewhat new. Those of you that have been involved with this as long as I have going back, there was a period of time where if you did not use your capacity, your total levy limit option that you had available to you, you could carry it over from year to year. Then we went to a much more restrictive time where that wasn't possible at all. And now, as the pendulum swings back and forth, we're at a point now where there are some ability to increase your levy by using capacity that you had available to you in past years but chose not to use. And there are two adjustments, A and R, that involve this ability to reach back to future capacity that you have and increase your levy because it is available to you. Now, the two carry forwards, though, are not just as simple as you had this capacity in the past and now you can take advantage of it and increase your levy because you didn't do that in previous years. So to start out with, in this chart, there's a couple different restrictions that are imposed on you and your ability to use these adjustments, again, that would allow you to increase your levy above the previous year's capacity and above the net new construction number that I mentioned earlier. On the one-year carry forward, there is a capped amount that it is at 1.5% of the previous year's actual levy. On the 5-year, there's a capped amount that it can't be more than 5% of the previous year's capped levy. So if you had an amount that you had available to you that was greater than that, you're still restricted to those percentages. Now, when do these two carry forward occur to you? When is it possible to use them? With the 1 year, your actual levy from last year must be less than what the allowable levy. And on the 5-year, the percentage increase in the actual levy from last year, less adjustments, you got to take the adjustments that you used in the prior year off, was less than the net new construction. So there is those provisions on the 1 year and 5-year that come into play. Using these does require extraordinary voting. If you choose on the 1 year to take up to a 0.5% increase that was available from previous years, simple majority vote will do it there. If you want to go from 0.5 up to 1.5%, the maximum, you do need a 3/4 majority for that. And on the 5-year, you do need a 2/3 majority. So it isn't, unless you're just taking the 0.5% on the 1 year, there is extraordinary voting requirements that are involved. Again, because there's nothing that can be just easy and an option available to you in terms of what the state is allowing, there are, on the 1 year, what we call a negative debt adjustment. And what this is on the 1 year carry forward, if you're a community, and there's very few that are left, that have debt that was issued before the levy limits went in place, so back before 2005, if you have a decrease in the levy from last year to this year for that specific pre-05 issue, and you decide to take the 1 year carry forward increase, you have to take that decrease as well in that same year. So again, you'd only do that if the increase was greater than the decrease from this debt. So again, it gets very involved. On the 5-year carry forward, that does not apply. And then finally, to make the 5-year carry forward, again, a little bit more restrictive, they did add a provision that if you're a community that, I'll give you an example, if you did a debt issue this year in 2016, such that your total indebtedness, your general obligation indebtedness, is now higher than it was in 15, you can't use this. So again, these are available, but you can see that you got to kind of meander through to be able to take advantage of these. Now, the next couple of slides I'm going to go through have to do with adjustments to the levy limit worksheet that allow you to increase your levy. One of the common areas I get some questions on it is about joint fire departments. And if a joint fire department does an increase in the charges, which cause you to in order to fund it, you as a community, it's going to exceed your limit, can you raise your levy to meet that increase? And you can, but there's some conditions that are going to apply that you'll have to adhere to be able to do so. One is that the increase that you can take in this situation, so your joint fire department has increased their charges. That increase over the prior year cannot exceed the change in the consumer price index plus 2%. So you're limited on how much on this adjustment to the levy limit you can increase. And secondly, every governing body that's involved in this joint fire department must adopt a resolution in favor. So if you have 4 or 5 that are in the joint fire department and one of them doesn't, then all of them can't take it. So again, these sort of things, if you're going to try to have a strategy to use this sort of an exception, you can see where you better plan very early in the process so that everybody's in line, because you could get to the very end, and if one of the entities said, we're not doing it, you're out of luck. Another adjustment, and this is a negative adjustment, that came into play in 2013, budget year 2013, was a negative adjustment for what was deemed to be covered services. And prior to this, a strategy that many communities used in dealing with the impact and restrictions of levy limits is they would move an expense that was previously covered by the levy over to a user charge. So as an example, if you did not have a stormwater utility, your community could create a stormwater utility, and expenses that you had previously charged to your levy, you would shift over to this new stormwater utility and they would be paid by a fee. By moving that over, you created capacity within the levy limit to levy for something else. So if you had police or fire going up, labor expenses, whatever it would be going up, you could move that over, charge a fee for that, and now start levying. By moving that stormwater out, you've got capacity on your levy. You can increase it in order to support those expenses. Well, over time, the state developed an understanding of what was going on, and then they put into place this negative adjustment for covered services. The covered services are the 5 that you see up on the screen: garbage collection, snow plowing, stormwater, as I mentioned, fire protection, and street sweeping. Now, what happens in a situation where you do what I described as an example and moved things over to a stormwater utility and freed up levy capacity is your limit is reduced by the amount of the estimated fee revenue resulting from the implementation of that user fee, or an increase in that user fee once it's in place. Remember, though, that this only applies to fees or increases on fees that were implemented on or after July 2nd of 2013. If you had a situation where the stormwater was in place before that and already covering the costs for stormwater-related costs, it's not applicable to that. But if you never created that stormwater utility and you created one now and started charging fees, to the extent that those fees are available, you need to have a corresponding reduction in your levy. Now, you may have some questions. How broad is this application? Pilot payments that you have set up for the type of services that I talked about, those 5 covered services, it applies there as well. You can get out of this, so to speak, by approving a referendum. It's a process you'd have to go through to do so. And even if the levy support is fully eliminated, so you do a full conversion from levy support for a particular project, one of those covered services, over to a user fee, the negative adjustment would apply every time you would do a rate increase, a fee increase in the future. So you can see it's very, very punitive. It makes it almost impossible to use that strategy I talked about at the beginning of really trying to use and shift a fee over. I recently had a discussion with a group of clerks and treasurers about levy limits. One of the questions that came up, though, and I forgot to put it on this slide, was a question of what if you privatized the service? So what if you had garbage collection was previously handled by the levy of your municipality, you shifted it over to a private service? Would you still have to take a negative adjustment in that case? No, you wouldn't. That is the one area where there is some potential flexibility. And just to finalize in terms of the impact of, again, this negative adjustment, this is an example on the first slide here where you do a full conversion after the July of 2013. And you can see you move it from a current tax levy under 16 budget to a user charge, and you actually set your user charge to be generating $105,000 in revenues to pay for that. Your levy would have to be reduced $105 under that situation for garbage collection. Second one, a fee increase to reduce a levy requirement. So in this one, we're reducing the levy from a 50-50 situation to $25,000 for levy, user charge $80,000. That adjustment in the user charges from $50,000 to $80,000 requires a $30,000 levy reduction to do that. So you can see very, very punitive. And finally, again, if it's in place, you've had it in place for a couple years, and you determine that you need to increase the revenues, raise the rates a little bit because the operation's gotten a little bit more expensive for garbage collection. Again, that once it's in place, if it's in place after 2013, any future increase requires a levy decrease. Even if the original levy contribution is lower than where you're at currently cost-wise. You have to still do each one of those increase and causes a negative impact on the levy. Okay, so with that in place, and now understanding some of these restrictions and the challenges, what are a couple options that you have available to you to deal with levy limits? One is a referendum. And I didn't put a slide together in that, but I think most of you who've been doing this for a while are probably aware you can go to the voters. I think there's been mixed results on that. Some have gotten those to pass, some have not. If you're going to go down the road, I've worked with a couple communities that have done that. Ehler's has. My suggestion would be start very early in the process. It's like most things. The more you can educate the voters about it and explain the situation, allow them to ask questions, the better results you're going to have. Now, the other two options I want to talk about this evening do not involve having to get approval from the voters to use these strategies. They involve the adjustments related to debt service that are on the levy limit worksheets. So the first one is using debt that was issued after 2005 by your municipality, and the debt, if you have a situation where part of that debt is paid by something other than the levy, okay, and we'll talk about that situation. The second is to use a strategy of issuing debt on a very short-term basis to pay for capital type projects that your community has that maybe in the past you would have financed within your budget and not issued debt for at all. So let's start with that abated, what I would call the abated post-2005 debt. The worksheet, the levy limit worksheet, allows you to put on the worksheet up to the full amount of principal and interest payments that you have on the debt service for a post-2005 issue. So if you look at the chart up here, in 2017, the total debt payment is $638,000 on this hypothetical debt issue. The municipality, though, is not paying 100% of this issue, 100% of that $638,000 from the levy. They're using revenues from the utilities, and impact fees to pay a portion of that. And then the net amount after collecting those utility revenues and the impact fees is what the community is actually levying to pay back this particular debt issue. That abated levy, which is the sum of the utility revenues and the impact fees, you are allowed to put that on the worksheet and raise your levy and collect that additional amount, even though you are using the utility revenues and the impact fees to make the payments on the debt not that levy revenue. So you can collect that and use it for something else in your budget. Okay, any questions on that? So I used utility revenues and impact fees in this example. Could be special assessments, could be tax increment district revenue. Any of those would fit and create that abated situation. Now, there's some things, of course, to think about, though, with this strategy. The advisability of claiming this, and the spot that you would do it on the worksheet is line E, of creating that greater than the actual need of payments that we should talk about, and we'll talk about here. The main thing to think about is, what are we using that money for? That capacity that is created because we're abating the levy. If we're using it for what I would describe as non-reoccurring, one-time projects, oftentimes maybe a capital project, that strategy can work. Where it can become problematic in the long run is if you're using it for an operating expense of your municipality. Because eventually, if we go back, you'll see that that total payment on the debt, eventually that debt issue is going to be paid off and go away. And if you have built into your overall budget that you need this abated levy capacity on the worksheet to pay for salaries or bills to operate your buildings, operating type health benefits, whatever it might be, at some point it's going to create a budget hole for you. So it's a good strategy, again, for capital or non-recurring type costs, one-time type costs. But again, if you implement it over a long period of time, you start doing it for recurring or operating type expenses, there may be a day of reckoning that comes on it, and you'll have a big budget hole at that point. The other option is what I would call the short-term financing strategy. I would say, in my experience with working with Wisconsin municipalities since levy limits have been put in place, is one of the unintended consequences of the levy limits is that many very short useful life assets that you have to fund, a police car, equipment, that public works equipment, fire equipment, things that you need but don't have a 10, 20-year useful life. Communities before levy limits could put those in their budget and pay cash for them. Levy, pay, done. What I've seen over time with levy limits being in place, those sorts of costs have moved more and more over into the borrowed realm. Because debt, the ability to issue debt and pay back the debt, is an adjustment to the levy limit if you use general obligation debt for that purpose. This strategy is one that is kind of in between. Instead of just saying, well, we got to issue debt for it, otherwise we can't pay for these, and we're going to pay that debt back over a 5-10-year period, what we are going to do as a community is we're going to issue the debt, but we're going to minimize how much interest we're going to have in that debt. So the strategy is that if you've got a list of capital projects that you need to fund for your community, and on this example I got squad cars, a plow truck, and a staff vehicle as an example. Instead of financing those on a 5-year debt issue or a 10-year debt issue, you issue debt as you're going through your budget process, so right now, and instead of having a 10-year or 5-year amortization, you have maybe a 1-year amortization, or even maybe a 90 to 120-day amortization, so that you pay that debt issue off early next year in 2017. This is allowable under the rules of the levy limits to do, and instead of incurring 5 or 10 years worth of interest for those types of projects, you're incurring 90 to 120 days. So if you could just budget cash for this, in this example, it would be $385,000 in your budget, done. In this case, because you have to issue some debt, and for a short period of time, it's $385 plus $2,406 in interest for a total of $387. And that can go on an adjustment to your levy limit worksheet. You can levy it, you follow all the rules, but instead of paying long-term debt interest on those projects, you finance them on a very short period of time and comply with the levy limit rules. So any questions on that? Anybody doing that currently? I see more and more communities thinking about it because it's a, again, it's a, oh, sure.
What's the shortest period then?
It doesn't say specifically in the law, but as this strategy has evolved, the opinion is that you have to allow at least enough time for the first tax year's collection to be actually collected. So you could not say the payment is due on January 2nd because taxes are payable through the end of January. And then there's also a settling period with them. Usually they go through a process before the dollars actually come back to the municipality. My recommendation would be March or April 1st, somewhere in that range. Okay. Any other questions on levy limits before we go into the debt section? Okay, great, thank you. In the remaining time, I'm going to go through just some of the big picture issues to think about with debt issuance. And again, if questions come up as we move through some of this material, feel free to ask those. If your community is considering the issuance of debt, the debt that you would issue would really fall into two categories, your two options. One is debt issued under the general obligation portion of the statutes. It's debt backed by the full faith and credit of your community. The other is revenue debt, which is debt backed by sewer utility, water utility, could be a tax increment district under some circumstances. So those are really your two main categories for you to issue debt. Geo debt limited by the size of your community, so it's 5% of the equalized value of your community. Revenue debt primarily limited to the degree that the utility or the revenue generating entity has enough money to pay the debt back. Of the two options, general obligation debt is the lowest cost because it's a stronger pledge, and it generally will carry the lowest interest rates. Now, where would you go to get financing? So you've made the decision you need to finance projects. Could be related to the levy limits, that you're going to use that strategy. Number of different sources. One is the commercial market, going out to any and everybody who are looking to buy bonds as an investment. And with that sort of financing, the cost of issuing that type of debt in the commercial market is going to be higher than the other options. The trade-off, though, is you generally get lower interest rates doing so. The best fit for the financings going to the commercial market, a little bit larger size debt issues, I would say in the $750,000 at least, over $1 million. And when you're looking for debt that's going to be 10 years, maybe up to 20 years in length. Another option is local or regional banks solicitation for your debt. Typically, this option will result in a lower cost of issuance. But one restriction with working with local banks is generally they will have a term. Some are willing to go to 10 years, some will only go 5 or 3 years in length. So you may lose some flexibility in locking in a fixed rate, and with interest rates very low right now, that can be somewhat penalizing. But that is certainly an option, and in Wisconsin there's a lot of activity. Banks are interested in municipal debt. Another option is the State Trust Fund Loan Program. Is anyone familiar with that program? Okay. That's a program by the Board of Commissioners of Public Lands, and they offer debt that can be on a fixed rate basis up to 20 years. Very flexible program. Interest rates range from 2.5% for shorter term debt, currently up to 3.5%. And the last two that I wanted to mention are sources of funds for debt issues that are primarily related to revenue debt issues. The state of Wisconsin offers 2 programs: safe drinking water for water utility projects that you need to do long-term debt for, clean water fund loan for sewer projects that you need to do long-term debt. Both offer very low interest rate, subsidized interest rate, long-term financing. There is a qualification process to go through to get the money. About the only negative I would say with those programs are there is a lot of administrative work up front for them, but the one negative is you don't have the ability to prepay on them. You have to get the state's permission to do so. The other is USDA, excuse me, rural development loans. Again, programs often used for long-term utility financing. The only caution I would mention with this program, on the one side, you can prepay it at any time, which is nice flexibility. You can get grants often with it, but it's more of a strategy, is making sure that if you're going to pay something, putting together a plan to pay something over 40 years, that what you're paying over 40 years lasts 40 years. And if it's not going to last 40 years, that you strongly consider paying more to pay it off faster, because the worst thing you can end up having is having to replace, say, a treatment plant 25 years into a 40-year debt. You still got another 15 years to pay on the old plant. Now you got to issue new debt. So it can be very attractive because by going out over 40 years, the annual costs are lower than if you're paying it back over 15 or 20 years, same as a mortgage, 15-year home mortgage to a 30-year. But just make sure that that useful life of that asset is going to match up with the financing. Another point I wanted to mention for you to understand what your options are. When you do a debt issue, particularly local bank or commercial market debt issue, there's 2 approaches that you can use. My preference in most cases is that you use the competitive approach, where you put out the financing for bidders to bid on, and then you have them competing with one another in an effort to get the lowest cost you can on your financing. This works very well for very well understood debt issues, and I would say that's utility revenue issues and general obligation issues. The other option is the negotiated, where you select one party to negotiate a debt transaction with them. That can fit, and it usually fits, in my opinion, with financings that are a little bit more complicated. So if you have a revenue stream like a tax increment district that's not well understood, or a new utility revenue that's not well understood, that might be the better result. I often, if you're going to go the negotiated route, I often recommend doing a first step to select somebody on a competitive basis and then negotiate with them. So you still are hearing from more voices in those situations. Another point that I wanted to touch on in talking about debt, there's a common understanding that if I'm issuing debt as a governmental entity, that the debt is automatically exempt from taxes, federal income taxes. That is the case in most debt issues that you as a municipality would consider and would do, but it's not in all. So there's some things to think about when you're going to issue debt to make sure that you can do it on that tax-exempt basis to get the lowest rates, or if you've got to do it on a taxable basis, you understand why that is the case. So why would it be the case? A couple things to just think about. If you have a debt issue that falls into what I would call the private business use category, an example of that would be if you have an industrial park that you're trying to develop, and you're going to borrow money to flatten, make the property developable, site ready, pad ready, as they say, and then you're going to turn that property over to a private owner. That site grading on a private, ultimately a private lot, would be an example of private business use. Okay? Another situation would be is if you, or if you had Baki Norman doing a development agreement for you as an example, on a development project, you're working, say, in a tax increment district, if in the provisions that your attorney is being asked to put a provision in there that if there's not enough revenues from, say, a tax increment district, there's a make-whole payment that has to come from the developer to make sure that the debt gets paid. I would call those a private payment or private security provision. Those can also cause debt to be taxable rather than tax exempt. That in and of itself isn't a bad thing, because a lot of times having those sort of provisions is worth having to pay a little bit higher interest rates on in a particular project. What's actually nice in this situation overall is, in order for debt to become taxable, both of those provisions need to be in place. So the project that you're financing has to be considered a private business project, site grading, and you have to have a private payment arrangement with the developer. If you have both of them, likely you're going to have to issue taxable debt. In another example, if you were doing street improvements in an infrastructure that are in the public right-of-way, but you were requiring the developer to have those payment provisions that they will make up if not enough revenues are available to pay the debt, in those situations, the debt would not have to be issued on a taxable basis. So if you're doing a development type project, I would encourage you to ask questions about these and make sure you're touching on them either with your attorney or your financial advisor, probably both, to make sure there's no surprises on how you're going to have to ultimately issue the debt, tax exempt or taxable. A couple other regulations to think about. Arbitrage you may have heard of. When you invest money that you borrow on a tax exempt basis until you need to spend it, there's a lot of rules about that. With interest rates, investment rates is low. They don't currently come into play, but it's something very much to be aware of. Not a lot of communities on this part of the state issue more than $10 million in debt in a calendar year. But if you go over $10 million, you issue what's called non-bank qualified debt. That can cost more because the interest rates end up being higher. So developing strategies to stay at or below $10 million can result in lower costs overall. And the other one that I see most commonly misunderstood is for tax-exempt debt, you cannot spend money from your general fund, as an example, and then decide a year later that you're going to reimburse yourself for those dollars. What you need to do is set up a declaration of intent when you spend those dollars up front that states we are reserving our ability to issue tax-exempt debt at a later date. This was put into place in the mid-'80s because there was communities going back 3-5 years and building back up their fund balance, issuing debt that was a long time ago. The federal government does everything they can to limit the amount of tax-exempt debt that gets issued, and this is one way they can do it, by making sure that you're not reaching back and issuing debt for projects that were done many, many years ago. A couple of state regulations on debt that I want to just spend a second on. If you do GO debt in Wisconsin, 20 years is the maximum payback. Revenue debt, you can go up to 40 years. Bonds and notes have the same pledge, but there's different terms. A note has to be paid back in 10 years. A bonds, you can go up to 20. And as I mentioned before, GO borrowing, lowest cost to you, most flexible, can be used for almost any project, limited to 5% of the equalized value of your community. Authorization of debt is different, whether you're a town, a city, or a village. Anyone care to guess who's got it easiest? Villages. Villages have the easiest path. Cities, majority of vote to approve the debt, so that's certainly not a big thing. But you often, if you're doing bonds, you need to first approve an initial resolution. It has to be published, and it's subject to a petition, a 30-day petition. Rarely happens, but does in some instances. That's for bonds. If you issue notes, you're not subject to that, but you are restricted to a 10-year amortization. Village, you don't have any of those provisions. So that's the most flexible. Towns, most restrictive. Majority of vote to issue the debt if it has village powers. Referendum required if the town is not adopted village powers to issue debt in any kind. Their notes, easier than bonds, have to do a referendum for bonds in town. And new money referendum is required under those situations for bonds. Okay. And to finish up on bonds, I know I'm pushing here toward the end. This is a reflection over the last 30 years of a common index. We call it the bond buyer index. You can see that rates are at the very, very low point when looking at it from that 30-year perspective. We actually hit the very low point of that index this year in 2016. But you also note on the very end, it's been going up lately. So rates are still at a very low point. And with that in mind, if you are, as a community, considering long-term debt, you're still in a very attractive market to do so. There was a comment about the election. We'll see what happens with the election. There could be some impact from that. But I always suggest that, just don't borrow money to borrow money. Make sure you understand your project and make sure you understand how much you really need before proceeding with the borrowing. And to finish up, what I wanted to hit on with tax increment financing tonight isn't really anything specifically related to the law. As Tom had mentioned, he and I have worked together over a number of years with a bunch of communities. I started in '94 doing municipal advising, financial advising. And in 1995, there was a tremendous amount of tax increment districts that were created in Wisconsin. You may have one of those districts. Those districts, their expenditure period is ending next year in 2017. So what you'll want to consider if you have a district like that is spending some time reviewing the cash flow and deciding if there's any final projects or amendments that you want to do for those districts before they reach their end of their expenditure period at that point. The other thing I wanted to mention, I think in next year, where in the past, once you've created a TIF, gone through the process, including the Joint Review Board, if those of you who are aware with TIF, county, school district, tech college all have a say when you do that. Next year, not only do you have to do that with the creation of district, but you have to have an annual meeting with those groups. So that'll be a requirement that comes into place next year. So I know we're up against the time, but 1, 2 questions, Tom, if there's any. There may not be any, but I'd be happy to answer any if there are. Well, great. I appreciate the opportunity. Nice seeing everyone this evening.